Welcome to another edition of my feature presentation surrounding something to do with coffee roasting. Today, it is going to be me discussing our new coffee release at Blending Room, which is Kigina Hill. And in it, I will talk about roasting for naturals and roasting on a machine that has recently been serviced. These are things that I think are fairly interesting if you're a coffee roaster. And I will admit, a couple of things that I have struggled with this week. So let's talk a little bit about the coffee. It is a natural processed red bourbon from Burundi, supplied to us by Omwani coffee importers based in York. It is a coffee that I have never roasted before. So when I came to do the roast profile planning, I had to go back to the age-old mechanics of how to roast a natural and what should you do from an origin or a cultivar that you've never really roasted before. It's just a little segue. I note that it is raining hard in the roastery today, so if you can hear pelting on the tin roof, it's because it's raining and I don't have a professional studio. So what did I need to do? Well, I know that a natural processed coffee has more reducing sugars available to it. So I wanted to make sure that the post-first crack development time was maybe a touch shorter than I would usually roast, say, from a washed counterpart from the same origin. As per my previous video, I wanted to attempt to target a 12% or thereabouts roast weight loss at the end of each of the batches. I wanted a target roast color of somewhere in excess of 100 points on the Agtron Gourmet scale. I wanted the cut profile to be vibrant, to have acidity, to have sweetness, and to be very expressive in character. I note that when I roast a new filter coffee, I want the rate of rise going into the Maillard reaction, so somewhere around 160 degrees Celsius on the bean temperature curve on the lorring, to be somewhere around 16 degrees Celsius per minute. Now I use in Cropster a reading that is every 15 seconds. So I want, as I'm approaching 160 degrees Celsius, for that rate of rise to be somewhere around 4 degrees per 15 seconds, because 4x of 4 is 16. Now, that is just a guide. It is a useful velocity to use when I was roasting coffee for filter. If I wanted to roast coffee that was specifically for espresso, I would reduce that rate of rise, reduce the energy, reduce the velocity, so as to extend the roast time and also present a different chemical construct throughout the roast itself. I would use somewhere between 12 and 14 degrees per minute on or around 160 degrees Celsius as a guide for a coffee I've never roasted before. But this, I wanted a roast for filter. So it was going to be somewhere around that point. The challenge, obviously, is when you put a coffee into the roasting drum, how do you apply heat to get to those points? How do you get to that end marker that you wish to achieve when it's the first batch? And doesn't matter how many trials you do on sample roasters, get that coffee into the production batch size, and it always works differently. It always tastes different than from a sample roaster, and it's just a bit nerve-wracking because you've got a whole bunch of cash locked in that roasting drum and all of the pressure on your shoulders to do a good job. That being said, I will always fall back to my mantra of an ever-declining rate of rise curve. I have understood that the lorring and my palate profile, I enjoy the pyramid heat approach. It allows me to be able to nurse the rate of rise effectively throughout the drying phase and the Maillard phase to present the coffee for first crack in somewhat of a controlled way. However, you'll see on the profiles that with naturals, as soon as you get into first crack, many coffees just want to race away thermally, and it can be quite difficult to keep all of that thermal momentum under control. How about having a look at the profiles now? Let's do it. On the screen, you'll see the 2 batches of Kigina Hill that I roasted for the subscribers of our company this week. You'll note that there is somewhat similar design and shape of the heat application. There's therefore somewhat similar a result of the bean curve And the rate of rise, again, is somewhat similar, up to and including first crack, beyond which there is a different degradation of that rate of rise for the remaining few seconds and minutes of the roast. The idea with roast 27393 was to control this dip and subsequent hump in rate of rise. In the subsequent batch, roast 27394, the blue curve. You'll note that I didn't manage to achieve this, and fortunately, having cupped and quality controlled the coffee, both cups taste wonderful, albeit I could do better next time. And the reason why I say I could do better is that I like this particular part of the roast to be well controlled. And for me, well controlled is a declining rate of rise, or a curve that shows a nice, neat and straight line down. That means that I have got the thermal momentum under control. I'm not allowing any of the progression to happen, that's the hump, or rapid loss, and that's the dip. The hypothesis is that either one of those events, a dip or a hump, may present flavor qualities or chemistries that are not as well-rounded and well-controlled as it would be should you have a nice, neat, straight line of rate of rise. However, these differences and nuances can be either profound in the cup or nuanced. And to be fair, these two coffees are nuanced. Why? Because they follow a very similar track. If I was able to get that under control, it may be a profound difference. However, the notion of these two roasts are to have two batches as close as I can match together so that I can release them to our subscribers, so that all of those subscribers have a somewhat similar experience, one bag to the other. The two notable differences on the cupping table for these particular coffees was the end temperature and post first crack development time. So in roast 27393, the first batch that I did, the end temperature was 212.2. That's a temperature mark that I am comfortable with, and I feel like I get good balance in the main for most of my coffees that I'm roasting for filter. When I'm roasting a new coffee, I have to have a marker that I'm aiming for. And those markers are based on the library of prior experience that a roaster will gain through time and cuppings. So I was somewhat happy with that. However, the test was knowing that I'm roasting a natural processed coffee from Northeast Africa, something with a lot of fruit characteristics, a lot of aromats within the coffee, is how and if can I present that more profoundly in the cup. So the idea then was to try to drop the coffee lower in temperature and with a shorter first crack development time. In order to achieve this, I needed to go into first crack with a tiny little bit less energy than the prior roast, and hope that I mitigate the trough and peak that I had in the previous batch in the batch that I was doing, which I actually didn't, and pull the coffee out earlier such to achieve a lower end temperature and that shorter first crack development time to present those wild and wacky flavors in the cup. On the cupping table, I achieved that. The lower end temperature has a more prominent fruit character inside of the cup. The slightly higher end temperature with the slightly longer development time has a touch more body, the fruit a touch more rounded. The coffee is delightful. It's really delicious. It's just a slightly different representation of the coffee than roast 394. So what will I do in subsequent batches to try and eradicate the bit that I don't like in this data? Well, I will attempt to do exactly the same with this heat. So approach first crack at the same percentage of gas, but rather than extending that gas period for the period of time that I actually did, I will continue the taper through that period rather than holding as I did in this particular coffee. I will worry less about achieving a lower end temperature because actually I think that would be well suited with this coffee. I will continue to have a shorter development time post first crack than I would usually run on a washed coffee from the same origin. I feel that those mechanics will present the coffee that I had in my mind on the cupping table. But of course, I've got to execute the batch and taste it in order to be confident that that's the truth. So let's have a little taste of the coffee to describe the flavors in the cup. This here is a filter batch brew, 3 days off roast from a Loring, and it is roast 393. The coffee that had the little bit longer development time and a slightly higher end temperature than the subsequent roast. The expectation with this is lots of fruit in the cup because of its natural processing and the cultivar red bourbon, plus the country of origin being Burundi. Those things combined tend to give you markers of strong fruit characters. And that is exactly what you get in aroma. The green beans smell pungently fruit forward with all of that natural processing. That then transpires into the roasted beans. As soon as you grind them, you get these ripe, pungent orange fruits and booziness on the nose. And then of course, that gets into the cup itself. So on the nose, you get this fresh, fruity nectarine and apricot and another sort of fleshy, juicy, fruity orange stone fruit. There's a bit of chocolate too, and I'm confident that those will actually combine into the cup. Which they do. You get this lovely brightness of nectarine. It's sweet. There's a touch of acidity, but the acidity isn't wildly pronounced. It's well controlled. You then get this sweet apricot, another fleshy stone fruits as well. I'd even say that there was a bit of plum in there too. And then on the finish, you get this wonderful chocolate characteristic. It's clean and crisp, which is an interesting thing about naturals today in the 21st century versus the naturals that I knew when I got started in roasting in 2008-9. All of the naturals were wild and funky and almost farmyard-like, but now they're refined and polite and just amazing. If I was to critique this coffee, I would say that the finish is a little bigger than I would want to. And I think I can pin that as a consequence to the end temperature and development time of the roast, which I had rectified somewhat in the subsequent roast in that lower temperature, shorter development time. This, however, will be really well suited to full immersion brewing and also espresso as well. You get all of those pungent fruits in the cup. The immersion brewing will really bring out all of that body and that chocolatey characteristic on the finish. And espresso, well, it'll just be intense everything. If I wanted to progress with a filter batch profile, I'd go to that 394. That is preferred, with a note to sort out the dip and the peak on or around first crack, and I think I'd have a sweet natural profile for Burundi. The other little tidbit of information here is roasting on your machine after a service. Be mindful that there will be some parameters of the roast apparatus that will have changed. In my instance, there was a slight adjustment in the requirement of gas because of a burner clean. I actually needed 2-3% more gas throughout the roast in order to maintain momentum versus profiles that I had been roasting the week prior. It could be mapped to the environment on the day. It was raining, and I do know that Lorings, I don't want to say struggle because that's the wrong word, but they operate differently in environments where there's heavy amounts of moisture and it's warm. And that was when I was roasting these coffees and also roasting the other batches that were my reference curves. So a tip, don't roast a new coffee the day after a service. Spend a day working with known quantities. I couldn't do that, however, because I had to roast this coffee for a release cycle that I needed to meet, and I needed to get the service done. So it was a case of, well, you just got to get on with it, James. But for those people who roast out there, maybe don't do that. And on that bombshell, I think it's time for me to wrap up. I hope this has been a useful insight into roasting red bourbons that are naturally processed from Burundi, the struggles of roasting a natural, the consequence of roasting a coffee with a slightly longer development time and a higher end temperature versus one that's shorter and lower. If you have any questions about the processes that I talk about, do feel free to drop a comment in the comment section below. I'm very happy to field questions on or around this particular coffee, or roasting on a Loring, or somewhat roasting on a Proba, albeit I haven't roasted on that thing for 14 months now. As usual, have a great week ahead. See you again next time.